Well, good afternoon, and welcome back to another political science video here at SLU. This is Bill McCormick with a video on Thomas Aquinas and Regno for our course for the spring 2020, POLS 3710 4360. I got all those course numbers wrong. Anyway, we talked a little bit in our last video about Thomas Aquinas, his thought, his history in general, and then we began to give an introduction to his work, which we are reading, De Regno. And one of the things we really emphasized in the last video is that its genre is different from the other works we've read, and certainly from the most famous works of Thomas Aquinas. It is a speculum principium. It is a mirror of princes intended pedagogically for the reader. And so it's not primarily a text directed to people who are studying politics, but much more meant to guide those who are living politics, who are doing politics, both to educate them, both to inspire and move them. So a somewhat more complex work in some ways in terms of its interpretation. So again, as we said last time, we have to wonder how and why is Aquinas presenting the political thought that he is presenting in this work? How is it supposed to help somebody who's directly involved in politics? Just to start with, the way I divided the text up into those three sections, I think is pretty important to the interpretation of the work. And if you want to learn more about that, I have a book forthcoming on Aquinas's De Regno in hopefully a year. But there are three distinct sections: Book 1, chapters 1 through 6, Book 1, chapters 7 through 12, and then Book 2, chapters 1 through 4. And I tend to see Aquinas's De Regno as as being constituted by these three distinct moments, these three distinct opportunities for Aquinas to present different teachings to our royal reader. And what's happening here is not that he's giving you three basic principles and then laying out how they intersect with each other and how they are derived and lead toward mutual conclusions, again in kind of a demonstrative fashion. But rather, he's sort of juxtaposing three distinct considerations for our king to consider. And the first consideration, which comes in chapters 1 through 6 of Book 1, is about the naturalness, nobility, and difficulty of politics. So if you were thinking, well, Thomas Aquinas, he's a theologian, he's obsessed with the divine law, the natural law, surely this is going to be a deeply theological work. These early chapters really impress you with how focused they are on nature and reason. And what he establishes early on is that politics is natural to human beings, that it's an activity we participate in our nature, through our nature, to complete our own nature. So politics is natural in several analogical senses for Aquinas. And he thinks we can know that through our reason itself, that if you look at human beings, they depend upon each other to survive, and they can use words and they can reason to act collectively. And we're also rather defenseless. We don't have a lot of weapons and we're kind of weak, especially academics. And so all of these different ways show us to be naturally gregarious or social, and most specifically political. This leads him then into a discussion about the best kinds of regimes, the best forms of government. And what's interesting here is so much of it strikes one as sort of classical, that there's some strong influence here of Aristotle, particularly. And that's really the focus of these first 6 chapters. Now, in the latter part of this section, we move into the problem of tyranny. And it's a really fascinating section. And if you're interested in tyranny, then this is certainly the best reading this course in this course that we'll read, because Aquinas is concerned with the problem of tyranny but he doesn't offer any obvious or quick solutions to the problem of the tyrant. He thinks that people need to obey their rulers, and if someone is being tyrannical, some superior authority should hopefully remove them from power. But if they aren't, if that's not possible, then it turns out that he says we need to pray to God for conversion and deliverance. And it's a really fascinating section because it seems like it's not just sort of a quietist, well, what can we do? Throw your hands up. But he really is saying that God will need to give human beings the grace, the knowledge, the virtue to make the best of a difficult situation and to emerge from it a better community and better people. So I don't think that, again, I don't think it's a moment of quietism. It's much more a suggestion that that politics is very difficult and tyranny is complex. There are no obvious, easy answers. So you put these things together, and what's the image you get of politics? That's really the question. What's the image of politics that emerges from these first 6 chapters of the Regno? I think it is precisely that politics is natural, it is important, it's noble. And so these are all teachings meant to bolster the king's sense of importance, that he has an important, powerful, influential role within the human community. But guess what? It's also quite difficult. So if the king has been led to believe that his work is really important, he probably will embrace this teaching, whereby it is also quite difficult, because of course he's the one who has invested interest in it, seeming like something most people can't do, but only the great king can do. And the implication about in this tyranny section is that actually a lot of kingdoms are not terribly just. The injustice is a very common problem in kingdoms. And in fact, if you read carefully, you'll see his distinction between mild tyranny and excessive tyranny. You might think that Aquinas is having kind of an Augustinian moment and implying that a lot of kingdoms are actually mild tyrannies. So Aquinas isn't just saying that politics is noble, that it's good, but it's really difficult. Yeah, and the king might fail. He might not always be terribly successful at it. So if the king is following along this pedagogy, I think the king is likely to be somewhat humble. This is a difficult task that's likely to lead to a lot of injustice. And in some ways, this seems very different from the early chapters of Aquinas' De Regno, where Aquinas is saying, look, politics is important, it's beautiful, it's noble, it makes us the good human beings we are. But it's actually quite consistent with it. If it is such important fundamental work, then it does seem quite likely that we'll not always succeed. So if we move to the second section, the last chapters of Book 1, chapters 7 through 12, what's fascinating is that Aquinas doesn't say, now here's how to make politics just. We've identified these difficulties at the end of chapter 6 of Book 1, so now let's talk about how to prevent all that injustice. No, he moves to a very different consideration, which is on the end of governance. And what's really interesting about this section of De Regno is you'll notice a kind of sleight of hand where Aquinas starts or begins with the question of what's the reward of the king? And in fact, this section of Aquinas' De Regno has often been called throughout history on the reward of the king, which in Latin is de praemio regis. But it shifts. It moves from the question of the reward of the king to the question of the end of the human person. And it's so important because you might think Aquinas is saying, wow, this is really hard work. We should give the king an amazing award, an amazing reward for his good work. Even though at the end of the first section of De Regno, we learn that the king will actually not always do the work very well. But now we're learning what is the end of the human person, which is to say, what is the point of politics? Why is the king operating out of this necessity of justice in the first place? What's the goal of political activity? And a lot of this section actually we've basically read in Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics and the Politics that riches and honor and glory, none of that is satisfactory as end to human happiness. Which is important because our king could very well be wanting to rule his kingdom for the sake of riches and honor and pride and glory. But Aquinas says, well, of course, we know none of that's good enough. What is it? Well, it's the Beatific Vision. It's happiness in and with God. So essentially, Aquinas is saying, you are ruling not out of these normal sort of desires for power and glory and wealth, but you're ruling to be the servant of God who is united with him in heaven. And guess what? You're not just seeking that for yourself. The king's supposed to seek that end, that happiness for all of his subjects. So it's an incredible sleight of hand, where Aquinas has sort of hooked the king in with like, well, what's the reward for this great work you've done? And two, this question of what is the end? What is the human happiness that you are seeking for all of your subjects? And it's an incredible claim, also because the first 6 chapters of Aquinas' De Regno can seem so Aristotelian and so naturalistic. But the second section suggests, no, there's a deeply theological, deeply scriptural argument at work as well. And I think if you take these two, so first of all, the king is being taught in the second section that his real motivation ought to be union with God, be it the Beatific Vision or being in heaven, as some people might say simply. And his motivation isn't just for himself, it's for all of his subjects. If you take these two sections together, though, if you juxtapose them as Aquinas does, so Book 1, Chapter 1 through 6, and Book 1, Chapter 7 through 12, you see a really interesting tableau. On the one hand, attention, you see on the one hand that the king is being called to do this really difficult, noble, important work, and he will often fail. And yet there is a tremendously great reward for this, for his attempt to govern successfully. Aquinas is almost forecasting, predicting prophetically that the king will often fail and will often commit injustice, and yet his reward will be far, far greater than he could ever imagine. It's far greater than riches and honors and glory, and it's far greater than anything he's securing for himself. He's securing it for his whole kingdom. So it's a really fascinating juxtaposition there, and I would encourage you to reflect on, to study, to think about why Aquinas is presenting these two really different pieces together, and what effect it would have on the king. What effect it would have on the king to be told, look, your job is difficult and painful, and look at this tremendous reward. And then, of course, the question is, for students of politics such as ourselves, what's the message we can take away? What are some lessons and claims that we can extrapolate from Aquinas's presentation of this material to his royal reader? But really delightful, really rich. And so our next video, we'll take a look at the third section, those first 4 chapters of Book 2. And then we'll try to piece together, how do these 3 pieces really hang together as an argument? And by the way, it's fine if you think that they don't completely hang together as an argument, because again, this is not a textbook. It's being presented to the king as something for his edification, for his education, for his inspiration. So I hope you're enjoying reading and thinking about this text as much as I am. And I look forward to your questions and papers, and we'll be talking about the third part soon enough. Take care.